Hi, everybody. Thanks for viewing this recording, which covers the American Rescue Plan Act and how you can use funds from the Act through your municipality or through your county to fund conservation, trails, parks, and recreation work that's critical to our communities and critical to Pennsylvania's recovery from COVID-19. My name is Silas Chamberlain. I'm Vice President of Economic and Community Development at the York County Economic Alliance. And I encourage you to share this information with others in your community, your network, your colleagues who may be interested in using these funds and need information about how to do so. My disclaimer with all this is that this document and these guidelines are based on my personal interpretation, the American Rescue Plan Act, but so are the other guidelines that you'll see released. The definitive source of information on the Act are the guidelines, the fact sheet, the frequently asked questions, and the final rule that U.S. Treasury has published on their website. So I do encourage you to review that. These guidelines that I'm sharing will continue to be revised over time as the U.S. Treasury provides clarity. And if you have things that you'd like to clarify or additional information or ways that you are using Rescue Plan Act funds creatively, I'd really like to know about them so we can share with others. So please feel free to email me any questions or additional information at silas.a.chamberlain@gmail.com. So what is the American Rescue Plan Act? This is the plan that was passed in March of 2021, passed by Congress, signed into law by President Joe Biden, and the overall package is $1.9 trillion for the entire nation. Nationally, the Act funds a lot of different things, significant funding for public education to be able to reopen and host in-person classes, significant funding for COVID testing and contact tracing and the CDC and its vaccine distribution efforts, but then some really important programs about rental assistance to keep people housed who may have suffered economic disruptions during COVID, and also funding for some of our subway and bus systems, airports, and other key transportation infrastructure. So this is a very broad act, but within that, there is a lot of funding coming locally. In Pennsylvania, the state government, counties, and local governments will all receive funding. The state will receive a total of $7.5 billion. Counties will receive direct allocations of $2.8 billion, and municipalities will receive a total of approximately $3.3 billion. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But the key thing to know is that this is a very, very significant, almost ahistorical infusion of funding into our state and our local communities, roughly double the amount that some of our counties were receiving under the CARES Act a year ago. So it's really worth paying attention to. So who's getting the funding and how much are they receiving? Every county and individual municipality in Pennsylvania will receive federal funds via the American Rescue Plan Act. That is different than the CARES Act that only provided funding to counties but not individual municipalities. County governments and municipalities with more than 50,000 residents will receive a direct allocation from the federal government. And there are lists out there for you to find your county allocation if you haven't seen it before. And municipalities with fewer than 50,000 residents, there are some exceptions to this, but every municipality will receive something, will receive their allocations of federal funds passed through from the state of Pennsylvania. And if you haven't seen your municipal allocation, I can certainly help you find that. Unfortunately, I can't click on the link in this recording. But rest assured that even very, very small boroughs and very sparsely populated townships are still receiving tens of thousands of dollars. Some of our more populous townships and larger boroughs, small cities are receiving millions of dollars in many cases. So how can the funds be used? These are the broader buckets of how they can be used. But in general, they're meant to aid in recovery from COVID-19 and the pandemic. Unlike funding under the CARES Act, you'll find that these funds are covering a significantly broader set of uses, a lot more flexibility, but still some ineligible uses and focus areas that you should be aware of. So the number one is supporting public health expenditures by funding COVID-19 mitigation efforts. Those are the kinds of things that you could imagine because they're what the CARES Act funded as well. Addressing negative economic impacts caused by the public health emergency, including economic harms to workers, households, small businesses, impacted industries and the public sector. That is a very vague heading, so there's a lot of interpretation that can come after that. But if you're thinking of the public sector and some of the services it provides, if you're thinking of impacted industries such as the tourism industry, then you can start to see some of the ways that our work can fit in. Replacing lost public sector revenue. So these are helping governments provide services that they would have been able to provide, but for loss of revenue from COVID. And then investing in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure focused around clean drinking water, supporting vital wastewater and stormwater infrastructure, and to expand access to broadband. That is one area that the Treasury Department was a little vague on early on, and now has clarified more around those specific types of infrastructure. Finally, in some guidelines that the Treasury released through a FAQ, they also clarified that supporting safe reopening of businesses in the tourism, travel, and hospitality industries, and to districts that were closed during COVID-19, as well as aiding a planned expansion or upgrade of tourism, travel, and hospitality facilities are all eligible expenses. It's important to keep on remembering within these overall categories, there is broad flexibility to decide how best to use the funding to meet the needs of communities. So looking at what this means for conservation, trails, park, and recreation, you'll note right away that those terms are not mentioned in the guidelines or in those overarching focus areas. However, Treasury has made clear that the guidelines do not represent an exclusive list of uses, and that there is latitude with counties and municipalities to determine what kind of projects they would fund. In their FAQs, the Treasury Department has also indicated that the same types of uses eligible under the CARES Act are mostly eligible under the Rescue Act. And in many counties in Pennsylvania and across the country, there was a precedent set under CARES of using these funds for conservation and recreation purposes. And so we believe that to be an appropriate use under the Rescue Act as well. As you determine what's eligible, you can keep in mind that you are trying to justify the use of these funds on your area of interest. And so there's some very specific ways you can do that. And you should keep in mind that trails, parks, and open space are crucial to our economic recovery. There are times when the economic development community, policymakers, don't recognize that trails and parks and open space are part of our economic development strategy, but the outdoor recreation economy in Pennsylvania is a $29 billion industry that sustains more than 251,000 jobs. And at a time during COVID, when many less resilient industries were disrupted, our outdoor economy thrived, and it kept many of our small towns and small businesses across the state open and functioning, and help support those businesses. So municipalities investing in parks, trails, and open space are not just doing all the other good things that we know those amenities do, but they're also creating platforms for economic development that will serve them well during future disruptions and during times of normal operations. It's also important to note that trails and parks are infrastructure. We don't always talk about them that way, but they provide well-documented stormwater benefits, which is specifically identified in the Rescue Act guidelines. They assist in local and regional multimodal transportation, alternative transportation, and active transportation. They provide corridors for broadband and other utilities. And trails in particular are already funded through federal infrastructure bills. So this is not a stretch to look at trails and parks as infrastructure. In fact, there's already established precedent for doing so. Another point is that parks, trails, and recreation are critical elements of our public health response and recovery. And we know that the first highlighted focus area of the Rescue Act is to fund our public health response and recovery. Public health and trails and parks and outdoor space have a connection, of course, well known prior to COVID, but in the last 18 months have become even more important as other recreational facilities have been closed, such as gyms, or were limited in capacity. They also provide essential benefits to mental health, and mental health is specifically called out in some of the Rescue Act guidelines. So very appropriate use in creating public health facilities in the form of parks, trails, and recreation. Parks, trails, and open space are also critical tourism assets. And when the Rescue Act talks about sectors that have been disrupted by COVID-19, the tourism and hospitality sectors are at the top of that list. And even today in 2021, continue to be deeply impacted by COVID. Trails, parks, open space have always been major drivers of tourism, but again, while the tourism and hospitality sector has been significantly disrupted and remains so during much of the pandemic, outdoor amenities have proved their resiliency and have continued to attract tourists and provide services to local residents, even during this time of economic and social disruption. As many of you know firsthand, parks and trails experienced exponential growth in visitation during the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, that helps sustain our local economies that rely on tourism across the state. Use of state parks and forests increased by 27% statewide during the pandemic. We know that some parks experienced even higher rates of use, and many trails experienced double, triple, quadruple the normal use that they would have in a non-COVID year. So this became critical tourism infrastructure, and we shouldn't let our communities forget that role that parks and trails and open space have played this role for the last 18 months. Finally, the Rescue Act talks a lot about ensuring that funding finds ways into communities that have faced historic disadvantages. Communities of color and low to moderate income communities especially suffer from disparities in access to trails and parks and open space. That has been exacerbated during COVID-19 as many communities turned to these spaces as a respite, but places without access did not have that opportunity. This is especially true in rural areas, but also very true in our largest cities. Fortunately, Pennsylvania DCNR, the Trust for Public Land, We Conserve PA, before COVID had produced a dynamic mapping tool that showed the parts of each county that lacks access to open space, including trails and parks, both in terms of walking and in driving. So supporting better access or new facilities in these areas would be consistent with rescue plan priorities that want to see the funding go to communities that have historically faced barriers to having these types of amenities. So I encourage you to look at that tool, use it to understand where there is great need in your community, and then allocate funding to help address that need. So what specific ways can the funds be spent? We just talked about how you can justify those funds. Again, this is a non-exclusive list. There's probably many, many other ways you could spend the funding depending on your county or municipality, but these are some things to consider. The construction of new trails, parks, recreation facilities, again, because they can be an important part of your economic recovery, public health management, and stormwater management, and other factors, of course. All the traditional reasons you know that trails are important. Maintaining trails, parks, sports fields, and other amenities that were damaged during the pandemic because of the heavy use of growing visitation. Funding of recreation programs reduced or eliminated due to municipal revenue losses. So that goes back to the revenue loss part of the rescue plan that says if a government lost revenue, they can use Rescue Act funds to pay for the services that they had to cut due to that lost revenue. Bicycle and pedestrian improvements. And there's a great opportunity here with some of the other infrastructure projects that might be funded in your community. So for example, if your municipality is replacing water lines, using Rescue Act funds for that, you can encourage them to install bicycle and pedestrian improvements during the repaving process. It's just one of many examples where you can start to tie this funding together. Another example would be park creation that also has a strong stormwater component to it. Trail or park construction or rehabilitation undertaken as part of a broadband project. So there will be literally billions of dollars flowing into broadband access over the course of the next several years, most of it at a federal level. But if you can look at your trail not only as a corridor for users, but also a corridor for utilities, and make that trail essential to your community because it provides a corridor for broadband access, which has become so much more important during COVID, then you really have a winning approach to getting your trail funded. Communities can also provide direct allocations to nonprofits, so they can cut a check directly to an organization to do any of the things that I just described. So, and including their own services, which are essential to the community, in the same way that small businesses and businesses of larger sizes are receiving Rescue Act funds to help in their recovery. The same can be true of our nonprofit business community. For us in the conservation community, that really means trying to get support to national and state heritage areas, conservation landscapes, our friends groups, our 501c3s that serve state and federal public lands. So your state park friends group, your national forest friends group, local national park friends group. Land and water conservancies, almost every county has one, including trail organizations, Trail Town, River Town, Outdoor Town programs, or the organizations that support those programs, your local and regional recreation commissions. Even if they're a part of county or local government, they can receive an allocation for their work. And then of course, our main streets and business improvement districts, which are also supporting our businesses, but may be engaged in things like nature-based placemaking, which certainly supports this work and would be eligible for funding. Communities may also create competitive grant programs writ large for their entire business community and their entire nonprofit community, but then prioritize funding to the types of organizations that provide components of the outdoor economy. They may also choose to make funding available to their TPA, their DMO, their CVB, whatever acronym you use in your area, and require that a portion of those funds be reserved for trails, parks, and businesses serving nature-based tourists. And not leave it up to chance that that funding will some way make their way to those organizations, but actually dictate it, which you can certainly do. And the important thing to note here, again, is that this is not an exclusive list. There may be many other ways to spend this funding that still aligns with some of these goals. But no matter what, these organizations that are receiving direct allocations and the projects themselves must still adhere to the eligibility guidelines in the Rescue Act funds. So you can't fund a group for them to go and do something totally unrelated to an economic, a public health, or a critical infrastructure need. So what is the timing for all this? Well, the timing is really right now. Your county or municipality will begin receiving funds in June 2021. So I think some counties have already received the first half of their funding. So the time for these conversations is happening now. Some communities, whether they're a county or a municipality, are forming advisory groups or task forces to help make recommendations through a public process to help their leadership decide how they'll allocate the funds. Others will make those decisions with very little public input or through council meetings or other opportunities that the public may or may not be that engaged with. In any case, the time to reach out is right now. You should not wait. You should formulate your ideas and move forward quickly. The timing overall for the Rescue Act funds is that they must be obligated by the recipient government by December 31st, 2024. Up until about a week ago, we thought that this is when all projects had to be completed and programs had to be completed, but the Treasury Department has now clarified that those funds just must be obligated by that date. They must be expended by December 31st, 2026. This allows for complex projects, multi-year projects, multi-year commitments to play out across that time period, which is amazing flexibility compared to the very limited time frame that the CARES Act had last year. It also allows communities to be much more strategic in how they use these funds. So what should you do right now if you care about getting funding towards conservation, trail, park, and recreation projects or organizations? You should reach out to your county or municipal leadership right now. Everybody else is doing this. Every nonprofit that knows what they're doing is reaching out. Every sector is making a case for funding. I know you probably don't feel like a lobbyist, but this is where you have to put on your advocacy hat and go out and make the case for your organization, because if you don't, you will not get an allocation just by chance. You can also just simply reach out to your community leadership and ask them how are they going to allocate the funds, or how are they going to make that decision, so that you can better understand the process and become involved in it. You should make your request formal. So write it on your letterhead, send it into your county or municipality, put down your needs and make your best case, but make it official so that it doesn't get lost in the shuffle. You can certainly share this memo or some of the other guidance, including the U.S. Treasury's guidance, with your county or municipal leadership. But the important thing is telling them that although the words trails, conservation, parks, and recreation don't show up in those guidelines, they certainly have the latitude to consider funding them with this allocation. It's also important to think pragmatically about this. We all know the importance of conservation and trails and recreation. We know that they are drivers of tourism and economic development. But unless you frame it that way, that's not a natural connection for most community leaders. So try to tie your proposal to economic development, business growth, tourism, and infrastructure, things that are eligible in the Rescue Act and things that are truly part of the work you do every day, although we don't often talk about it like that. It's also a great time to go public. Have your board members reach out, write an op-ed about your organization's contribution during COVID, how important your park or trail has become, and how well your community used it, and how you need more of those assets. Issue a press release. Talk about this with your leadership and give them talking points. This is what private sector groups do. This is what advocacy groups do every day, and you are just as deserving as those funds as they are. I encourage you to also use data. If you have great data that shows your park or trail experienced a 300% increase in use, that tells you that people really, really love your facility and that you need more of them so there isn't overcrowding in the future. And that's where you can use that great DCNR map to identify other areas where you can expand use and serve more people. Finally, use your creativity. You know your trail, your park, your organization better than anybody else. You know why it's important. You know what your needs are. So don't be afraid to ask and just go out and advocate for it. The worst thing that you could do and what you shouldn't do right now is wait. Let someone brush you off or, of course, misuse these funds. If you wait, you'll miss the opportunity to get on that list of allocatees, and you'll miss your opportunity to make a case before your county or municipal leadership have already designated those funds. Don't let someone brush you off, because the reality is that these U.S. Treasury guidelines are not entirely clear. They are publicly available. They're intentionally written to be flexible, and different groups will put their own interpretations of the guidelines out. If someone, like for example, a solicitor, tells you that they are 100% certain that these funds are not eligible for that use, that's a red herring that they are being dismissive, because it's not true that the guidelines are 100% clear. They are likely giving you their opinion and not a fact. And of course, you need to be professional, and you don't want to hurt your project or relationships in the long run, but you should be confident in making a case that these are worthy projects, that they are part of our economic recovery and our public health recovery, and they are important infrastructure. And when you make a case like that, it's certainly eligible for Rescue Act funds. And of course, don't misuse these funds. Don't try to push the boundaries, because there are enough legitimate uses of Rescue Act funds without needing to bend any of the rules. And of course, it also happens to be fraud to bend the rules. That's a bit of a whirlwind, but that is my best interpretation of how organizations can try to tap into these funds to do really important work statewide. Again, if you have examples of ways that your municipality or county has invested Rescue Act's funds in conservation, trails, open space, or recreation, I'd really love to know so we can incorporate them into future communications about this program. And if you're interested in a printable version of my memo based on these points, you can certainly email me and get a copy. And I'm also happy to answer any questions you might have. So thanks again for your interest in this program. And please give it a shot and try to secure some of these funds for your important work. Thanks.